What if everything you have ever heard about the Anunnaki was only the middle of the story? What if the beings worshipped as gods by the first civilizations of Earth were themselves servants of something older? And what if the reason they disappeared was not because they lost a war, abandoned humanity, or returned to the stars, but because a power beyond even the gods commanded them to leave? Tonight, we travel back more than 5,000 years into a world of clay tablets, forgotten temples, and secrets buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. A world where priests whispered questions they dared not ask aloud. A world where the greatest mystery was not who the gods were, but who stood above them. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Then dim the lights, settle comfortably, and let us step into one of the oldest mysteries ever recorded. There was a question that the priests of ancient Sumer rarely spoke aloud, not because they lacked curiosity, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they understood how dangerous the answer might be. The cities of Sumer stood between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers thousands of years before Rome existed, before Greece had risen, before most of the great civilizations of history had even been imagined. To the people who lived there, the world seemed simple. The gods ruled. The Anunnaki had descended from heaven. They had founded cities. They had established kingship. They had taught humanity agriculture, writing, law, astronomy, and ritual. Every major city belonged to one of them. Enlil ruled from Nippur. Enki ruled from Eridu. Inanna ruled from Uruk. Nanna watched over Ur. The gods lived in temples. Their statues were dressed each morning. Food was offered to them daily. Priests served them. Kings governed in their name. Everything revolved around their presence. For generations beyond counting, this arrangement appeared eternal. Yet hidden within the oldest myths was an uncomfortable detail. The gods were powerful, but they were not first. This detail appears so quietly in ancient texts that most people pass over it without noticing. The stories begin with gods. But when the oldest scribes describe the beginning of existence itself, they describe something else entirely. Before Enlil, before Enki, before Inanna, before the Anunnaki, before the heavens had names, before the earth had boundaries, before cities, before temples, before kings, there was something older. The earliest creation stories describe a condition that existed before any divine personality emerged. An endless state without form, without hierarchy, without order, without even language. The ancient scribes struggled to describe it. How do you describe something that existed before words? How do you explain a reality that existed before concepts? Again and again they returned to symbols. Primordial waters, infinite darkness, boundless potential, a condition older than existence itself. Most listeners hear these stories and imagine mythology, the ancient equivalent of fairy tales. But the priests who preserved these traditions treated them differently. For them, these accounts were not entertainment. They were memory. Fragments of something inherited from generations long gone. And in those fragments appeared a disturbing implication. The gods themselves emerged from this older reality. They were not creators of it. They were products of it. Imagine being a priest in ancient Sumer. You spend your life serving divine beings. You dedicate every waking hour to honoring them. You record their laws. You preserve their stories. You teach others that they govern the universe. Then, one day, while studying ancient tablets, you encounter a line suggesting that even these mighty gods once had a beginning. What conclusion would you draw? If the gods began somewhere, what existed before them? And if something existed before them, could that thing possess authority greater than theirs? Most priests avoided following that thought too far. It was safer to focus on rituals, safer to focus on offerings, safer to focus on maintaining the order society depended upon. Yet some could not stop wondering. The question lingered. Quiet, persistent, dangerous. And then another mystery appeared. Because the Anunnaki did something unexpected. They left, not all at once, not in a single dramatic event, but gradually. The language of the texts began to change. The earliest writings spoke of gods as present realities, living forces involved in daily life. Later texts spoke of them differently, more distant, more elusive, more absent. Something had shifted. The change was subtle enough that most people never noticed. But scribes noticed. Priests noticed. Generations of scholars noticed. The gods seemed to be withdrawing. Temple records became filled with longing. Laments appeared. Prayers sounded different. The relationship between humanity and the divine was changing. And hidden beneath these changes was another question. If the gods had once come to earth, and if they later departed, who decided when that cycle would end? Who could command gods? Who could determine the beginning and conclusion of their authority? Who could tell the rulers of heaven that their time on earth was finished? Somewhere in the darkness of forgotten centuries, the first hints of an answer were already waiting. Not in the stories of the gods themselves, but in the stories of what existed before them. And that is where our journey truly begins. Long before the first temple rose above the Mesopotamian plains, before kings carved their names into stone, before humanity learned to write a single symbol into wet clay, there existed a memory, not a memory carried by people, not a memory preserved in books, a memory embedded within the oldest stories themselves. The priests of Sumer inherited these stories from generations so distant that even they no longer knew where the stories had originated. Yet they copied them, again and again, century after century, dynasty after dynasty, because they believed something important had been preserved inside them, something older than civilization, something older than the gods. To understand why the Anunnaki eventually lost their power over Earth, we must first travel to the beginning of beginnings, to a time before heaven had a name, to a time before Earth existed, to a time before the first god opened its eyes. The ancient text known today as the Enuma-Elish begins with a sentence unlike almost anything found in later religious traditions. It does not begin with a creator. It does not begin with a divine command. It does not begin with a supreme ruler. Instead, it begins with absence, a condition before order, a condition before structure, a condition before distinction. The text tells us that there was a time when heaven had not yet been named, when earth had not yet been named, when nothing possessed identity, nothing possessed boundaries, nothing possessed purpose. There were only primordial waters, endless, silent, without form. The Sumerians and Babylonians would later give names to these waters: Apsu and Tiamat. Most modern readers imagine these as gods, but the oldest descriptions are stranger than that. Much stranger. Apsu was not simply a deity. He was the freshwater abyss itself, the infinite source beneath all rivers, the unseen depth beneath creation. Tiamat was not simply a goddess. She was the vast, saltwater ocean of chaos, the limitless potential from which all things could emerge. Together, they represented something difficult for modern minds to grasp, a state of existence before existence, a reality before reality. And according to the ancient texts, even the gods had not yet been born. Pause for a moment and consider how extraordinary that statement truly is. The gods had not yet been born, not created humanity, not descended from heaven, not ruled cities, not fought wars, not established laws. They did not exist. The beings who would one day become the mighty Anunnaki were still hidden within something older than themselves. The implications are enormous, because if the gods emerge from a deeper source, then the source itself must possess greater authority than anything that came after it. This realization sat quietly inside the mythology for thousands of years, visible, yet rarely discussed. The priests copied the words faithfully, but few dared to follow their meaning all the way to its conclusion. As the story continues, the primordial waters begin to stir. Movement appears, then awareness, then will, and eventually new beings emerge. The first generations of gods, young, powerful, restless. The ancient texts describe them as noisy, active, full of energy. Their presence disturbs the primordial silence. Again, this sounds simple on the surface, yet hidden underneath is something profound. The oldest gods are not portrayed as creators of reality. They are portrayed as children growing inside reality. The universe already exists. The primordial condition already exists. The deeper structure already exists. The gods arrive later. This distinction may seem small, but it changes everything, because it means the Anunnaki inherited a universe they did not create, a universe governed by laws that already existed, a universe shaped by forces older than themselves. And eventually, those older forces would become impossible to ignore. The myth tells us that conflict emerged. Apsu grew angry. The younger gods disrupted the ancient stillness. Their activity disturbed the primordial order. Their noise spread through creation. And so Apsu decided something drastic. He would destroy them, not punish them, not discipline them, destroy them completely. But before he could act, one of the younger gods intervened. Enki, the future Lord of Wisdom, the future protector of humanity, the future keeper of hidden knowledge. Enki acted first. Through cunning and intelligence, he defeated Apsu, the ancient source of fresh water, the primordial being older than the gods themselves. On the surface, this appears to be a simple victory story. The new generation defeats the old. Order replaces chaos. The future triumphs over the past. That is how the myth is usually interpreted. But the details tell a different story. Because after defeating Apsu, Enki does something peculiar. He does not destroy the ancient source. He does not erase it. He does not leave it behind. Instead, he builds his dwelling inside it. The great god of wisdom establishes his home within the remains of the primordial abyss. His palace stands in the depths of the Abzu, the sacred waters, the hidden source beneath the world. Think about that carefully. The most knowledgeable of the Anunnaki draws his power from something older than himself. His wisdom flows from a place that existed before the gods. His authority depends upon foundations he did not create. The symbolism is impossible to miss. Even the wisest of the gods stands upon borrowed ground. And Enki knew it, perhaps better than anyone. That may explain why he was different from the others, why he repeatedly questioned decisions made by the divine assembly, why he protected humanity when others wished to destroy it, why he left clues behind, why he seemed to understand that the future belonged to something beyond the gods themselves. But Enki's story was only beginning, because another ancient power still remained. Tiamat, the great mother of primordial chaos. And before the struggle between old and new was finished, the heavens themselves would tremble beneath her shadow. The war that followed would become one of the most important stories ever preserved in human memory. Not because of who won, but because of what the victory revealed. The ancient texts tell us that after the death of Apsu, the balance of the cosmos began to shift. Tiamat remained, silent at first, watching, waiting. The primordial mother had witnessed the destruction of one of the oldest powers in existence. The younger gods believed the danger had passed. They celebrated. They expanded their influence. They organized themselves into hierarchies. They built the foundations of what would eventually become the divine order. But deep beneath the surface of creation, something was changing. The ancient silence was ending. The old powers were awakening. And Tiamat remembered. The stories describe her transformation in vivid detail. The great primordial ocean became enraged. She began gathering forces, ancient creatures, monsters, serpents, dragons, beings born from the earliest layers of existence, not creations of the younger gods, not servants of heaven, but manifestations of a reality that had existed before divine rule. To modern readers, these creatures often sound like fantasy, yet the symbolism behind them is remarkably consistent. They represent forces that cannot be controlled, forces that refuse to fit within ordered systems, forces older than civilization itself. Chaos, potential, unpredictability, the raw fabric from which reality emerged. The younger gods grew frightened. For the first time, they faced something that could not simply be governed, something that did not recognize their authority, something that had never agreed to their rules. The assembly of gods gathered. One after another, they hesitated. One after another, they refused to confront Tiamat directly. The stories emphasize this repeatedly. Even powerful gods stepped back. Even mighty beings feared what stood before them. Why? Because on some level, they understood the truth. Tiamat was not merely another rival. She represented the source from which they themselves had emerged. She was older than their authority, older than their kingdoms, older than their identities. To fight her was to fight their own origin. Eventually, one god stepped forward, Marduk, young, ambitious, brilliant, the future ruler of heaven, the future king of the divine assembly. But before he agreed to face Tiamat, he demanded something extraordinary. He wanted absolute authority. The texts describe a negotiation unlike anything that came before. Marduk did not simply volunteer. He made a condition. If he defeated Tiamat, the other gods would grant him supreme power. Their authority, their obedience, their loyalty. And so, the gods agreed. A great banquet was held. Oaths were sworn. Destinies were proclaimed. Marduk became the champion of the younger gods. Then came the battle, one of the oldest cosmic wars ever recorded. The descriptions are dramatic. Storms, winds, thunder, cosmic weapons, heaven itself trembling beneath the conflict. But hidden within the spectacle lies a detail many people overlook. Marduk does not create power. He acquires it. He gathers weapons, receives authority, obtains support. Everything he uses comes from elsewhere. Nothing originates solely from him. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian mythology. Power is never truly self-generated. It is inherited, delegated, transferred, bestowed, borrowed. The gods possess tremendous authority, yet that authority always seems connected to something beyond themselves. Finally, Marduk defeats Tiamat. The primordial mother falls. The younger gods celebrate. Order triumphs. Civilization becomes possible. At least that is how the story is usually told. But something strange happens next. Something that changes the entire meaning of the myth. Marduk does not erase Tiamat. He does not annihilate her existence. Instead, he uses her body to create the world. The heavens are formed from one half, the earth from the other. Think about what that means. Every mountain, every river, every city, every temple, every kingdom, every human life exists within a reality built from the remains of a power older than the gods. The Anunnaki become rulers of a world constructed from something that preceded them. Their kingdom is literally built upon an older foundation, a foundation they neither created nor fully control. Imagine a king inheriting an empire. He governs it, commands armies, issues laws, receives worship. Yet every road, every wall, every city, and every resource was built by someone else long before he arrived. How much of that empire truly belongs to him? This is the hidden tension embedded throughout Mesopotamian mythology. The gods rule, but they rule within a structure they inherited. The more carefully one reads the ancient texts, the more this pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Again and again the stories reveal limits, boundaries, conditions, restrictions. The gods possess enormous power, yet they never appear completely free. There are always laws, always obligations, always destinies, always forces operating behind the visible order. And nowhere is this more obvious than in one particular object. An object so important that entire wars were fought over it. An object associated not with military power, but with authority itself. The Tablets of Destiny. The ancient texts describe them as the ultimate symbol of cosmic governance. Whoever possessed the tablets could direct the order of the world. Whoever controlled them held authority over fate. Kings desired them. Gods fought for them. Entire myths revolve around their possession. But here is the unsettling detail. The tablets existed before Marduk acquired them, before the younger gods gained supremacy, before the final victory over Tiamat. The tablets were already there, waiting, existing, part of a deeper reality. In other words, even destiny itself appears older than the gods who claim to rule it. The implications are profound. If the tablets of destiny are older than the rulers who wield them, then perhaps fate itself is older than the divine assembly. Perhaps the Anunnaki govern only because something allows them to govern. Perhaps their authority exists only because a deeper order permits it. And if that deeper order once granted authority, could it also take that authority away? Somewhere within the oldest temples of Sumer, scribes copied these stories onto clay, generation after generation. Many probably never asked such questions, but a few certainly did. A few must have noticed. A few must have understood. The gods appeared powerful, yet the foundations beneath them appeared even more powerful. And buried deep within those foundations was a secret that would eventually explain why the Anunnaki themselves could not remain on Earth forever. Among all the gods of ancient Mesopotamia, one figure stands apart. Not because he was the strongest, not because he ruled the largest kingdom, not because he commanded the greatest armies of heaven, but because he seemed to understand something the others did not. His name was Enki, Lord of wisdom, keeper of secrets, master of the sacred waters. If there was any member of the Anunnaki who glimpsed the truth hidden behind reality itself, the ancient stories suggest it was him. Again and again, the myths place Enki in a unique position. Whenever conflict emerges among the gods, he sees a path others overlook. Whenever destruction appears inevitable, he searches for another solution. Whenever fate seems fixed, he somehow finds room to move within it. Yet what makes Enki truly fascinating is not his cleverness. It is the source of that cleverness. Because according to the oldest traditions, his wisdom did not originate with him. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere hidden beneath the world. The place was called the Abzu. To modern readers, the word often sounds like a location, a mythical underground sea, a sacred reservoir beneath creation. And in one sense, that is true. But the ancient texts describe it as far more than geography. The Abzu was the source beneath all sources, the hidden freshwater ocean from which rivers emerged, the invisible foundation supporting the visible world. And most importantly, it was the dwelling place of Enki himself. There, beneath the earth, far from the noise of gods and men, stood his palace. A realm of silence, a realm of knowledge, a realm where mysteries were stored. The stories repeatedly tell us that when gods sought wisdom, they came to Enki. When kings sought guidance, they turned toward Enki. When hidden knowledge needed protection, it was entrusted to Enki. Yet few people stop to ask a simple question. Why? Why him? Why not Enlil? Why not Anu? Why not Marduk? The answer may lie in the very nature of the Abzu itself. Remember what the oldest myths tell us. Apsu, the primordial source, existed before the gods. Enki defeated Apsu. But then he established his home within the remains of that ancient power. In symbolic terms, this means something extraordinary. The god of wisdom chose to live closer to the origin than any of the others. While many gods occupied temples and heavens, Enki remained connected to the source beneath creation, as though he understood that true authority flowed upward from deeper levels of reality, not downward from thrones. The connection appears repeatedly throughout mythology. Many of the most important objects in existence are linked to Enki's domain. Among them were the mysterious Me, the sacred principles that govern civilization itself. Modern scholars often translate the Me as divine powers, decrees, or cosmic ordinances. Yet none of those translations fully captures their meaning. The Me were not simply laws. They were the patterns that made reality function. Kingship was a Me. Wisdom was a Me. Craftsmanship was a Me. Justice was a Me. Language was a Me. Even concepts such as truth, authority, and social order were described as Me. Everything that allowed civilization to exist belonged to this collection of cosmic principles. And where were they kept? In the possession of Enki. The implications are remarkable. The gods did not invent the me. They managed them, protected them, distributed them. But the stories never claim that the gods created them. The me already existed, like the tablets of destiny, like the primordial waters, like the deeper laws woven into reality itself. Again, we encounter the same pattern. The Anunnaki appear not as creators of ultimate reality, but as administrators of a structure they inherited. One famous story illustrates this perfectly. It concerns Inanna, the brilliant goddess of love, war, ambition, and transformation. One day, according to the myths, Inanna visited Enki in the Abzu. The two shared a great feast. They drank, they celebrated, they spoke long into the night. And during the gathering, Enki did something unexpected. He handed over the me, one by one, the sacred powers of civilization, the foundations upon which cities and kingdoms depended. Inanna accepted them, loaded them onto her vessel, and departed. When Enki later realized what had happened, he attempted to recover them. Messengers were sent, commands were issued. Yet the effort failed. Inanna reached her city of Uruk. The transfer became permanent. At first glance, the story resembles a tale of trickery, but beneath the surface lies something deeper. The me can move. Authority can move. Power can move. The structure remains. The custodians change. This is one of the most important themes in all Mesopotamian mythology. Nothing possesses absolute ownership, not even the gods. Everything operates within a greater framework. Everything serves a larger order. And perhaps no one understood this better than Enki. That understanding becomes especially important during one of the most famous events in ancient myth, the Great Flood. Many cultures preserve flood stories, but the Mesopotamian version is among the oldest. According to the ancient accounts, humanity had become troublesome, too numerous, too independent, too disruptive. Some gods wanted humanity destroyed. The decision seemed inevitable. The divine assembly reached its conclusion. A flood would erase civilization. Yet once again, Enki acted differently. Instead of supporting destruction, he warned a human. The man is known by different names in different traditions: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. The details vary, but the core remains the same. Enki secretly preserves humanity. Why? Why repeatedly side with mortals against the wishes of powerful gods? Why risk angering the divine assembly? The standard explanation is compassion. And perhaps compassion played a role. But there may be something more. Perhaps Enki recognized a change occurring within humanity itself. A change connected to the deeper laws governing existence. A change that other gods failed to understand. Perhaps he realized that humanity was becoming something new, something not originally anticipated, something capable of carrying the next stage of the story forward. If that were true, then the eventual departure of the Anunnaki would no longer appear mysterious. It would become inevitable. Because if humanity was evolving beyond its original role, then the age of direct divine rule could not continue forever. And according to some of the oldest traditions, Enki may have known this long before anyone else. Long before the temples fell silent. Long before the gods withdrew. Long before the night when the sky itself would speak in light. for that night was approaching, and when it arrived, everything would change. There are moments in history that seem ordinary while they are happening. A king signs a decree. A city opens its gates. A traveler leaves home. Only much later do people realize they were witnessing the end of an age. The departure of the Anunnaki appears to have been one of those moments. At first, nobody understood what was happening. There was no grand announcement, no proclamation carved into stone, no final speech from the gods. Instead, there were signs. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The ancient cities of Mesopotamia had always believed that the gods were present, not symbolically, not metaphorically. Present. The temple was not merely a place of worship, it was a residence. The god lived there. The priests served there. The city depended upon that relationship. When crops flourished, it was because the god was pleased. When armies triumphed, it was because the god provided protection. When disasters struck, people assumed the divine presence had weakened. The connection between humans and gods was direct, personal, immediate. And then, gradually, something changed. The records become strange. Temple hymns become more nostalgic. Prayers become more desperate. Laments become more common. The language shifts in a subtle but unmistakable way. The gods are spoken of less as neighbors, more as memories, less as rulers walking among humanity, more as distant figures beyond reach. Imagine being a priest in one of those ancient cities. You wake before dawn. You enter the temple. You perform the rituals exactly as your father performed them, exactly as his father performed them, exactly as generations before him performed them. The incense burns. The offerings are prepared. The sacred words are recited. Yet something feels different. The silence seems deeper. The presence feels weaker. The answers no longer come. No one says it aloud. No one dares. But everyone feels it. The gods are withdrawing. Some of the most haunting texts from Mesopotamia come from this period. Not because they describe battles, not because they describe disasters, but because they describe absence. A terrible absence. One text tells of a goddess standing inside her abandoned city, looking upon empty streets, listening to the wind move through ruined buildings, weeping because she can no longer remain. Think about that image. A goddess weeping, not because she lacks power, not because she has been defeated, but because she must leave. The distinction matters. The texts do not portray the gods as victims. They portray them as participants in something unavoidable, something larger than themselves. Again and again, this theme appears. The gods protest. The gods mourn. The gods hesitate. Yet they go, as though a decision has already been made somewhere beyond their authority. One of the most fascinating examples appears in the ancient laments concerning the destruction of Sumerian cities. Modern historians explain these events through invasion, political collapse, economic decline. And they are not wrong. Those things happened. But the ancient writers viewed the events differently. To them, the cities did not fall because enemies arrived. The enemies arrived because the gods had already departed. Cause and effect were reversed. First, the divine presence left. Then, the visible world changed. This perspective reveals something profound about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood reality. For them, physical events were manifestations of deeper movements occurring behind the scenes. The visible world followed invisible laws, and those laws governed everyone. Humans, kings, priests, even gods, especially gods. One of the oldest laments describes divine beings gathering before the destruction of a great city. The goddesses plead. The local deities beg for mercy. They ask that the city be spared. They argue. They protest. Yet the decision remains unchanged. The city must fall, not because someone wishes it, not because someone hates it, because the decree already exists. The pattern has already been determined. The cycle has already turned. Reading these passages today feels strangely modern. The gods resemble officials carrying out orders they did not create, administrators of a system larger than themselves, guardians of a process they cannot fully alter. And if that interpretation is correct, then a startling possibility emerges. Perhaps the Anunnaki never truly ruled Earth in the absolute sense people imagine. Perhaps they governed Earth, managed Earth, guided Earth, but always within boundaries established by something deeper, something older, something hidden. That possibility becomes even more intriguing when we encounter one of the strangest accounts preserved in Mesopotamian tradition. An account remembered centuries after the event itself. A story concerning a night unlike any other. A night when the heavens behaved strangely. A night when witnesses claimed the sky spoke through light. Ancient records describe brilliant illuminations appearing across the heavens. Not once, but repeatedly. 7 times. Each manifestation different from the last. Colors changing. Patterns shifting. The entire sky transformed into a living display. For generations afterward, scribes preserved references to the event. Most details were eventually lost. Fragments remained. Memories survived. Stories endured. And woven through those fragments appears a recurring theme. After the lights came silence. Not ordinary silence. A profound silence. The kind people notice. The kind that makes entire cities uneasy. The kind that lingers long after an event has passed. 3 days, according to some traditions. 3 days during which people felt that something fundamental had changed. 3 days during which the world seemed to pause between one chapter and the next. Only later did many begin connecting that night to a larger mystery. The mystery of the departing gods. The mystery of empty temples. The mystery of fading voices. The mystery of why the Anunnaki no longer stood openly among humanity. Perhaps the lights were a sign. Perhaps they were a coincidence. No one can say with certainty. But the symbolism is difficult to ignore. 7 manifestations. Completion. 3 days of silence. Transition. Then a new era begins. An era in which humanity would increasingly stand alone, or at least appear to stand alone, because the deeper laws governing reality had not vanished. The structure remained. The question was no longer whether the gods existed. The question was why the age of their direct rule had ended. And hidden within the answer was a concept more powerful than any individual god. A concept the ancient scribes struggled to describe. A force without a face. A law without a ruler. Something that existed before the first divine throne was ever occupied. Something that even the Anunnaki could not disobey. If you were a priest living in ancient Sumer, there were questions you could ask. And there were questions you could not. You could ask why crops failed, why a king lost a war, why a river flooded, why disease spread through a city. The gods had answers for such things. The rituals addressed them. The temples existed because of them. But there was one question that led into dangerous territory. Who governs the governors? Who rules the rulers? Who commands those who command everyone else? The deeper one studied the oldest tablets, the more difficult it became to avoid this question, because the evidence appeared everywhere. The gods possessed power, yet their power always seemed conditional. They ruled, but within boundaries. They commanded, but within limits. They judged, but according to standards they themselves did not create. The ancient scribes never assembled these clues into a single explanation. Instead, they appear scattered across myths, hymns, prayers, and royal inscriptions, like fragments of a broken mirror. Each fragment reflects part of a larger truth. One of the clearest examples appears in the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld. At first glance, it seems like a tale about death and rebirth. A goddess enters the realm of her sister. She passes through 7 gates. At each gate, she surrenders something: a crown, jewelry, symbols of power. By the time she reaches the deepest chamber, she stands completely stripped of authority. Then, something shocking happens. She dies, not symbolically, not metaphorically. The texts describe her body hanging lifeless, the mighty goddess of heaven reduced to helplessness. Eventually, she returns. The story continues. The cycle completes. Yet, hidden inside the narrative is a detail many readers overlook. When Inanna approaches the underworld, the gatekeeper does not immediately allow entry. Instead, permission must be granted according to ancient laws. Not laws created by the underworld, not laws created by Inanna, not laws created by the divine assembly. Older laws. The wording differs between translations, but the implication remains remarkably consistent. There are rules that predate the gods themselves, rules that even divine beings must obey. Think about that. A goddess can command armies, influence kings, shape civilizations. Yet when she reaches a certain boundary, her authority ends. Something older takes precedence. The story is not unique. The same pattern appears repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian tradition. Again and again, gods encounter limitations. Again and again, they submit to structures beyond themselves. The most important of these structures was known through a concept modern scholars call the me. We mentioned them before, but their true significance deserves closer attention. Imagine a universe operating according to invisible principles. Not physical laws in the modern scientific sense, something broader. Principles governing existence itself. Principles determining how reality unfolds. What makes a king legitimate? What allows language to function? What creates harmony? What produces chaos? What permits life? What defines death? The me represented these foundations. The remarkable thing is that the gods never appear as creators of the me. They discover them, manage them, transfer them, protect them. But they do not invent them. That distinction changes everything. Because if the gods are not the source of the deepest laws, then they are participants within a system larger than themselves. A system that existed before their arrival. A system that will continue after their departure. Many ancient cultures developed similar ideas. The names changed. The symbols changed. The languages changed. Yet the pattern remained. In later Jewish mysticism, some thinkers spoke of an infinite reality beyond all descriptions. A source beyond names, beyond attributes, beyond even the concept of divinity. In ancient China, philosophers described the Tao, the underlying order from which all things emerge, something impossible to define completely, something existing before distinctions. In India, certain traditions spoke of an ultimate reality beyond gods, forms, and appearances, different civilizations, different centuries, different languages, yet strangely similar intuitions, a reality behind reality, a foundation beneath foundations, a source deeper than any individual deity. The Sumerians may have been among the first to glimpse this possibility, not directly, only through fragments, only through hints, only through symbols. But the hints are difficult to ignore. The deeper one travels into Mesopotamian mythology, the less the gods resemble absolute rulers, and the more they resemble administrators, custodians, stewards, powerful stewards, certainly, yet still servants of something greater. Perhaps this explains why so many myths describe councils of gods, meetings, debates, disagreements, votes, negotiations. Why would all-powerful beings need councils? Why would absolute rulers require discussion? The answer may be simple, because none of them possessed absolute authority. Each controlled part of a larger system. Each fulfilled a role. Each carried responsibilities. But the system itself remained beyond any individual god. This perspective transforms the mystery of the Anunnaki. Instead of asking who defeated them, we begin asking a different question. What happens when a role is completed? Imagine actors performing in a play. They wear costumes, speak lines, occupy positions of importance. For a time, they appear central to the entire production. Yet eventually, the performance ends. The actors leave the stage. Not because they failed, not because they were overthrown, because their role was finished. What if the Anunnaki experienced something similar? What if their departure was not a defeat? What if it was the completion of a function, the completion of an assignment, the fulfillment of a cycle established long before their arrival? This possibility appears repeatedly within the ancient texts, especially in stories involving destiny. The Mesopotamian concept of destiny differed from modern ideas. It was not simply prediction. It was structure, the underlying pattern shaping existence. Every king had a destiny. Every city had a destiny. Every nation had a destiny. Even the gods had destinies. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. If the gods possessed destinies, then something existed capable of assigning them. Something capable of determining beginnings and endings. Something capable of establishing the duration of divine authority itself. The ancient scribes never gave this mystery a clear face, never described a throne, never named a supreme ruler standing above the gods. Instead, they described something stranger, a principle, a structure, a law woven into existence itself, invisible, nameless, unavoidable. And if that law truly governed the Anunnaki, then the reason for their departure may have had nothing to do with conflict, nothing to do with rebellion, nothing to do with punishment. It may have been something far more profound. Because somewhere in the distant past, humanity itself had begun to change, and that change was quietly rewriting the relationship between gods and mortals. The oldest myths describe humanity in a surprisingly practical way. Not as the center of creation, not as the ultimate purpose of existence, but as workers, assistants, caretakers. The Sumerian texts tell us that before humans existed, the gods themselves performed many of the tasks required to maintain the world. Fields needed tending, canals needed digging, cities needed building. Order required constant effort. Eventually, according to the stories, the burden became too great. The gods grew weary, and so humanity was created. The details vary from text to text. Some versions speak of divine blood mixed with clay. Others describe sacred acts performed by powerful deities. But the conclusion remains the same. Humans entered existence with a purpose, to support the divine order, to maintain civilization, to serve the structure established by the gods. For thousands of years, this relationship appeared stable. The gods ruled, humans obeyed, temples flourished, kings governed, priests interpreted divine will. Everything seemed to function according to plan. Yet hidden within the myths are signs that the plan began to change. At first, the signs are subtle, almost invisible. Then they become impossible to ignore. One of the most famous examples appears in the ancient flood narratives. Modern readers usually focus on the flood itself, the destruction, the survival of a chosen individual, the similarities to later traditions. But buried beneath the story lies a curious detail. The gods are disturbed by humanity. The standard translation often says humans became too noisy, too loud, too disruptive. Yet some scholars have suggested that the original meaning may carry a deeper implication, not merely physical noise, independence, unpredictability, behavior outside the expected pattern. In other words, humanity was no longer functioning exactly as intended. Something had changed. Imagine designing a tool for a specific purpose. Then one day, the tool begins making decisions on its own, not malfunctioning, evolving, exceeding its original role. That appears to be how some of the myths describe humanity's development. The gods created workers. But over time, something else emerged. Curiosity, creativity, self-awareness, the desire to question, the desire to seek, the desire to understand. These qualities transformed human beings from servants into participants. And participation changes everything. Because once a being begins asking questions, it can no longer be managed in the same way. The ancient stories seem strangely aware of this transformation. Again and again, humans acquire knowledge. Again and again, boundaries are crossed. Again and again, the gap between mortals and gods narrows, not in terms of power, but in terms of consciousness. The most fascinating figure in this process remains Enki. Whenever knowledge appears, he is nearby. Whenever humanity advances, his influence can be felt. Whenever restrictions are challenged, he seems unusually sympathetic. Consider the flood once more. The divine assembly reaches a decision. Humanity will be destroyed. The decree is established. The outcome appears unavoidable. Yet Enki intervenes, not openly, not through rebellion, but through wisdom, through understanding, through a recognition that something important is unfolding. Many ancient interpreters viewed his actions as mercy, and perhaps they were. But another possibility exists. Perhaps Enki recognized that humanity's transformation was not a mistake. Perhaps it was the next stage of the larger design. If so, then the conflict among the gods takes on a completely different meaning. It is no longer a disagreement about punishment. It becomes a disagreement about the future. Some gods wish to preserve the old order. Others sense that the old order was ending. Throughout history, similar patterns appear whenever civilizations undergo profound change. The established structure resists. the emerging structure advances. Neither side fully understands what is happening. Both believe they are defending reality. Yet, reality itself is already moving forward. The ancient myths may be describing something similar, a transition so vast that even the gods struggle to comprehend it. There is another clue hidden in the stories. The gods increasingly become distant as human civilization develops. This seems backward. One might expect divine rulers to become more involved as society grows more complex. Instead, the opposite occurs. Human institutions expand. Human laws become more sophisticated. Human knowledge increases, and divine intervention becomes less direct. The shift unfolds gradually over centuries. At first, kings rule because gods appoint them. Later, kings justify authority through legal systems. At first, priests serve as intermediaries. Later, philosophers begin asking questions priests cannot answer. At first, truth comes from revelation. Later, truth increasingly comes from investigation, observation, reasoning, experience. The center of gravity slowly moves, away from heaven, toward humanity. Not because humans overthrow the gods, because something deeper is changing. The relationship itself is evolving. This possibility becomes even more intriguing when we examine how later generations remembered the Anunnaki. The earliest records speak of presence. The later records speak of absence. But they do not speak of defeat. There are no grand stories describing victorious enemies expelling the gods. No myths describing a superior power conquering them. No accounts of divine collapse. Instead, there is departure, withdrawal, completion, as though a chapter simply reached its conclusion. The more closely one studies the pattern, the more difficult it becomes to view the departure of the Anunnaki as a catastrophe. It begins to resemble a transition, a transfer, a passing of responsibility. Imagine parents teaching a child. At first, they provide constant guidance, constant protection, constant instruction. Every decision passes through them. But eventually, the child matures. The guidance becomes less direct. The protection becomes less visible. The responsibility shifts. Not because the parents disappear, not because they cease to care, but because growth requires space. What if humanity experienced something similar? What if the age of the gods ended because humanity had reached a new stage? A stage requiring freedom rather than supervision, exploration rather than instruction, seeking rather than receiving. This possibility appears repeatedly in later mystical traditions. Again and again, spiritual teachers describe a movement from dependence to direct understanding, from obedience to awareness, from external authority to inner discovery. Perhaps the same process was already being described thousands of years ago on clay tablets beside the rivers of Mesopotamia. If that interpretation is correct, then the departure of the Anunnaki was not merely about the gods. It was about humanity. Because the moment the gods stepped back, something extraordinary became possible. For the first time, human beings would have to search for truth on their own. And according to some of the oldest traditions, Enki anticipated that moment long before anyone else. Which is why, before the age of direct divine rule ended, he is said to have left behind 3 mysterious keys. Keys hidden not in temples, not in palaces, but in the structure of reality itself. The stories never say that Enki left behind a final book. They never describe a secret chamber filled with answers. They never tell us that the God of wisdom handed humanity a complete map of reality before departing. Instead, the tradition suggests something far more interesting. He left clues, directions, patterns, 3 keys, not keys made of metal, not keys hidden in temples, keys woven into existence itself. If the ancient stories are to be believed, Enki understood something fundamental. Truth cannot simply be given. It must be discovered. A person who receives an answer gains information. A person who finds an answer gains understanding. The difference is enormous, and perhaps that is why the age following the departure of the Anunnaki became the age of searching. Searching the heavens, searching the earth, searching the mind. The first key was hidden in the sky. To modern people, the stars often seem decorative, beautiful lights scattered across the night. To the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, they were something else entirely. The sky was a text, a living manuscript, a language written in motion. For thousands of years, Sumerian and Babylonian astronomers observed the heavens with astonishing dedication. Night after night, generation after generation, they recorded planetary movements, tracked eclipses, measured cycles, calculated patterns, long before telescopes existed, long before modern science emerged. Why? Because they believed the heavens reflected the deeper structure of reality. Not metaphorically, literally. The movement of celestial bodies revealed hidden laws. The stars were not gods. They were signs, indicators, expressions of something greater. Imagine standing atop a temple platform 5,000 years ago. The desert air cool after sunset. The city asleep below. The stars spread across the darkness above. No artificial lights, no noise, only silence and movement. Tiny movements almost impossible to detect unless observed over years. Those movements fascinated the priests because they revealed consistency, order, reliability, patterns that did not change. Empires rose and fell. Kings lived and died. Cities flourished and vanished. Yet the heavens continued their silent journey. The same cycles, the same rhythms, the same laws. Perhaps that is why Enki's first key was said to point upward. Because the sky demonstrated something important. Reality possesses structure. Structure exists independently of rulers, independently of civilizations, independently even of gods. The second key was hidden in stone. This key is stranger, and perhaps more mysterious. Ancient builders often constructed monuments according to precise proportions. Temples, ziggurats, sacred complexes. The measurements were not random. The relationships between dimensions mattered. Harmony mattered. Balance mattered. To modern eyes, these choices often appear aesthetic, but many ancient traditions viewed proportion as something deeper, a reflection of underlying order. The same patterns appearing in nature appeared in architecture. The same relationships governing growth appeared in sacred construction. The same mathematics appeared again and again, as though reality itself preferred certain arrangements, certain ratios, certain forms. A river branches according to patterns. A tree grows according to patterns. Shells form according to patterns. Galaxies rotate according to patterns. The ancient builders noticed. They paid attention, and they encoded those observations into stone. Imagine a master builder standing before a rising temple. Workers carry materials. Measurements are checked repeatedly. Every angle matters. Every proportion matters. Because the structure is not merely a building. It is a model, a reflection, a physical expression of invisible laws. The temple becomes a reminder, a lesson carved into matter itself. The world is not chaos. The world possesses order. The same order visible in the stars. The same order hidden beneath change. The same order that existed before the gods. The same order that remained after they left. Then comes the third key, the most subtle of all. Language. The ancient scribes treated writing with extraordinary reverence. To us, writing is commonplace. We use words constantly. Messages, books, documents, conversations. But the first civilizations experienced writing differently. Writing transformed reality. A spoken word vanished. A written word remained. Thoughts could cross generations. Knowledge could survive death. Memory could become permanent. The scribes understood the power of this transformation. That is why they devoted entire lives to mastering symbols. Some trained for decades, learning signs, meanings, variations, structures. And through that training, they discovered something remarkable. Language shapes perception. The words available to a civilization influence what that civilization can think. New concepts create new possibilities. New names create new categories. New symbols reveal new relationships. Language is not merely a tool. It is a framework, a lens, a bridge between mind and reality. Perhaps this was Enki's third key, the realization that understanding requires expression. That reality becomes visible through interpretation. That the search for truth depends upon the language used to pursue it. Sky, stone, language, three keys, three paths, three approaches to the same mystery. Observe reality. Study structure. Seek understanding. Notice what these keys do not include. No secret weapon, no magical artifact, no hidden throne. No divine shortcut, only methods, ways of searching, ways of seeing, ways of discovering. This becomes even more interesting when we remember what happened after the Anunnaki disappeared. Humanity did not collapse. Civilizations continued. Knowledge expanded. Mathematics advanced. Astronomy advanced. Philosophy emerged. Science eventually emerged. The search continued. In some sense, humanity spent the next several thousand years following the very paths those three keys represented. Looking upward, looking outward, looking inward, trying to understand the laws beneath appearances, trying to understand the structure behind events, trying to understand what the ancient priests had glimpsed but never fully explained. And perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps the departure of the gods created a necessary absence, a space in which searching could begin. Because as long as divine rulers stood directly before humanity, there was little reason to seek deeper answers. The answers appeared to stand right there. But once the gods withdrew, the questions remained. The mystery remained. The longing remained. And that longing became one of the most powerful forces in human history. It drove explorers across oceans. It drove philosophers into contemplation. It drove astronomers toward the stars. It drove mystics into silence. It drove humanity forward. And according to the oldest traditions, Enki understood this as long before anyone else, which is why, on the final night before the old age ended, the god of wisdom is said to have lingered longer than the others, watching the waters, watching the stars, knowing that humanity's greatest journey was only beginning. If the stories are correct, then the final message of Enki was never delivered through a speech. No great farewell survives. No tablet records a last proclamation addressed to humanity. Instead, the message seems to exist within the pattern of events themselves, as though the God of wisdom understood that words would eventually be forgotten. But examples would remain, stories would remain, questions would remain, and questions, if powerful enough, can survive longer than answers. Imagine the world during the final centuries of direct divine rule. The temples still stand, the rituals continue, the sacred fires burn. Yet beneath the surface, something irreversible is unfolding. Humanity is changing. The old relationship between gods and mortals no longer functions as it once did. The transformation is gradual enough that few recognize it. A generation notices nothing. A century notices little. Several centuries later, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. The center of human attention is shifting, not away from spirituality, not away from wonder, but away from dependence. The earliest civilizations sought guidance from above. Increasingly, later civilizations begin seeking understanding through observation. The stars become objects of study. Nature becomes an object of study. The mind becomes an object of study. Reality itself becomes an object of study. The search that Enki seemed to encourage is spreading, and perhaps this was always his intention. Among all the Anunnaki, he consistently appears as the patron of knowledge. Not merely sacred knowledge, practical knowledge, useful knowledge, transformative knowledge. He teaches agriculture, engineering, writing, measurement, navigation, craftsmanship, skills that empower people to act independently. Notice how different this is from simple obedience. A ruler who wishes to maintain control discourages independence. A teacher who wishes to create successors encourages it. The distinction may reveal everything. What if Enki never intended humanity to remain dependent upon the gods? What if his role was preparation? Preparation for a future in which humanity would continue alone, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply responsible for its own development. This possibility explains many otherwise puzzling aspects of the myths. Why preserve knowledge? Why teach skills? Why encourage growth? Why repeatedly protect humanity during moments of crisis? Why preserve a species that increasingly challenges divine authority? The answer may be surprisingly simple, because growth was the goal, not control, and growth eventually requires freedom. Imagine a civilization forever guided by visible gods. Every major decision receives divine instruction. Every uncertainty receives immediate clarification. Every mystery receives a direct answer. Such a civilization might remain stable. But would it grow? Would it explore? Would it innovate? Would it discover? Perhaps not. Discovery requires uncertainty. Curiosity requires mystery. Progress requires unanswered questions. The departure of the Anunnaki may have created precisely those conditions. For the first time, humanity faced a world without obvious divine supervision. The heavens became silent. The temples grew quieter. The old certainties weakened. And into that silence rushed something new. Philosophy, science, investigation, reflection, The long human search for understanding. The timing is difficult to ignore. Across different regions of the world, humanity begins asking deeper questions. What is reality? What is justice? What is consciousness? What is existence? What lies beyond appearance? These questions emerge again and again. Different cultures, different languages, different continents, yet remarkably similar concerns, almost as though humanity collectively entered a new stage of development, a stage no longer focused solely on survival, or obedience, or tradition, a stage focused on understanding. This brings us back to the mystery that began our journey. Who took the power of the Anunnaki? Who removed them from Earth? Who ended their rule? After everything we have explored, the answer begins to look very different from what most people expect. Perhaps no one took their power. Perhaps no enemy defeated them. Perhaps no rival overthrew them. Perhaps the question itself is based upon a misunderstanding. Power implies ownership. Ownership implies permanence. Yet nothing in the ancient stories suggests the Anunnaki possessed permanent authority. Their authority appears assigned, conditional, connected to a larger structure, a larger process, a larger purpose, and once that purpose reached completion, the authority naturally passed. Like a torch handed from one runner to the next, the torch remains. The runner changes. Civilizations often struggle with this idea. People like permanence. They like certainty. They like believing that powerful institutions will last forever. History repeatedly teaches otherwise. Empires rise and fall. Dynasties rise and fall. Religions rise and fall. Ideas rise and fall. The pattern remains constant. Everything participates in cycles. Everything occupies a season. Everything fulfills a role. Then change arrives. The gods themselves appear subject to the same principle, not because they are weak, because they are part of reality. And reality moves, always. The final message hidden within the myths may therefore be surprisingly hopeful. The departure of the Anunnaki was not the end of humanity's story. It was the beginning of humanity's responsibility. A transfer rather than a loss. A challenge rather than a punishment. A new chapter rather than a conclusion. And according to the oldest traditions, Enki understood this before anyone else. He watched humanity developing. He watched curiosity awakening. He watched questions multiplying. And he knew something the others perhaps did not. The future would belong not to those who possessed answers, but to those willing to search for them. Yet even Enki's wisdom pointed toward a final mystery. Because beyond the gods, beyond humanity, beyond civilizations and stars and worlds themselves, there remained one final question. The question hidden beneath every myth. The question waiting behind every story. If the gods served a greater order, then what exactly was that order? What was the true God before the gods? Now we arrive at the final question. The question hidden beneath every temple, beneath every myth, beneath every prayer carved into clay thousands of years ago. If the Anunnaki were not the highest authority, if they inherited their power, if they obeyed laws older than themselves, then what was the source? Who or what stood before the gods? For centuries, scholars, priests, philosophers, and mystics have approached this mystery from different directions. Some search through myths, some search through mathematics, some search through meditation, some search through the stars. Yet all eventually encountered the same problem. The deeper they traveled, the more difficult it became to describe what they found. Language itself seemed inadequate. Names became obstacles. Definitions became limitations. Every description appeared too small. The ancient Sumerians may have understood this better than we often realize. Notice something remarkable. Their oldest traditions never clearly identify a supreme ruler standing above all other beings. There is no obvious emperor of existence sitting upon a cosmic throne. No final god commanding every event directly. Instead, the stories point toward something less personal, and perhaps more profound. A structure, a principle, a reality. Something that exists whether anyone observes it or not. Something that remains unchanged while civilizations rise and fall. The stars obey it. Nature obeys it. Time obeys it. Even the gods obey it. Throughout our journey, we encountered this mystery repeatedly. The primordial waters existed before the gods. The me existed before the gods. The tablets of destiny existed before the gods. The laws governing life and death existed before the gods. The cycles shaping history existed before the gods. Again and again, the same message appeared. The gods participate in reality. They do not own reality. That distinction changes everything. Imagine standing beside the ocean. You can sail across it, study it, map it, fish within it, even rule territories bordering it. But none of those activities grant ownership of the sea itself. The sea remains what it is, independent, vast, beyond possession. The ancient myths seem to suggest something similar about existence. The gods navigated reality, governed aspects of reality, worked within reality, yet reality itself remained beyond them. Perhaps this is what the oldest priests eventually realized. Perhaps this is why some questions remained unspoken, not because the answers were forbidden, because the answers pointed beyond mythology itself, beyond personalities, beyond stories, toward something much larger. Many later traditions would arrive at similar conclusions. Different names emerged. Different symbols emerged. Yet the underlying intuition remained remarkably consistent. Reality possesses an underlying order, a hidden coherence, a foundation beneath appearances. Some called it divine. Some called it cosmic law. Some called it ultimate reality. Some refused to name it at all. The names matter less than the pattern, because every attempt points toward the same mystery. Something existed before the first god. Something remains after the last empire. Something survives every cycle of creation and destruction. The Sumerians may never have described this mystery directly. Instead, they approached it through stories, through symbols, through myths that guided listeners toward questions rather than conclusions. And perhaps that was intentional. After all, certainty often ends exploration. Mystery keeps exploration alive. This brings us back to humanity, the true heirs of the story. When the Anunnaki departed, they did not leave behind empty hands. They left behind questions. Questions powerful enough to shape the next several thousand years of human history. What is reality? What is consciousness? Why does order exist? Where do laws come from? What lies beyond appearances? Those questions fueled philosophy, science, religion, art, exploration, civilization itself. The departure of the gods did not end the search. It began the search. And perhaps that was always the purpose. Perhaps humanity was never meant to remain beneath the guidance of divine rulers forever. Perhaps humanity was meant to become a seeker, a participant, a conscious explorer within a universe filled with mystery. The old myths suggest that the gods understood this, especially Enki, the wise one, the teacher, the keeper of hidden knowledge. Perhaps that is why he spent so much time giving humanity tools instead of answers, because answers have limits. Tools create journeys, and journeys create understanding. Now imagine the final scene. The temples stand silent beneath the stars. The great cities sleep. The rivers continue their endless flow toward the sea. The gods have withdrawn beyond sight. The old age has ended. A new age has begun. Above, the heavens move according to their eternal rhythms. Below, humanity begins its long search, searching the sky, searching the earth, searching itself. And somewhere beyond every civilization, beyond every myth, beyond every god ever worshipped, the deeper mystery remains. Silent, patient, waiting, not demanding belief, not demanding obedience, only inviting discovery. Perhaps that was the true God before the gods, not a ruler, not a king, not a being seated upon a throne, but the eternal reality from which all things emerge, the reality that gives birth to stars, to worlds, to gods, to humanity, and to every question ever asked beneath the night sky. The Anunnaki came, the Anunnaki ruled, the Anunnaki departed. But the mystery that existed before them remains. And tonight, as the stars continue their ancient journey overhead, it remains exactly where it has always been, waiting for the next seeker to look up and wonder why.